Beneath the Greenland ice was an aircraft, a World War II fighter hidden so completely that there was nothing to see on the surface. For years, people searched for it, and when they finally worked out where it was, they discovered something extraordinary. The aircraft wasn't beneath 10 feet of snow, or 20, or even 50. It was approximately 268 feet down, and it wasn't alone. 50 years earlier, 8 American warplanes had landed on this ice. 6 fighters, 2 heavy bombers, 25 men. The men would eventually escape. The aircraft would not. This is the story of the Lost Squadron and of the extraordinary effort to bring one of those aircraft back from beneath the ice. July 1942. America had entered the Second World War only months earlier. Across the Atlantic, Britain was preparing for the arrival of enormous numbers of American aircraft, equipment, and men. But first, they had to get there. Some aircraft would cross the Atlantic not aboard ships, but through the air. Canada, Greenland, Iceland, then Britain. A chain of remote airfields stretching across one of the most challenging flying routes in the world. The operation formed part of the vast Allied buildup known as Operation Bolero. And on the 15th of July, 8 American aircraft prepared to leave Greenland for the next stage of their journey. 6 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 25 men in total. Their destination was Iceland, and beyond that, the war in Europe. But they would never reach Iceland. Over the North Atlantic, the weather began to deteriorate. Cloud thickened, visibility fell, and the route ahead became increasingly uncertain. Continuing toward Iceland was becoming dangerous, so the formation turned back toward Greenland. But turning around solved only one problem. While the weather was getting worse, their fuel was getting lower. The P-38s had already been airborne for hours, and every minute spent searching for a safe route back used more of it. Eventually, there was no longer enough fuel to continue searching. The pilots needed somewhere to land, and they needed it soon. Beneath them, there was only ice. Brad McManus was one of the pilots running particularly low on fuel, so he went first. From the air, the Greenland ice looked smooth and solid. McManus hoped he might still save his aircraft. Rather than deliberately landing on its belly, he lowered the landing gear. At first, it seemed to work. The P-38 touched down and rolled across the snow. Then the nose wheel dug in, the fighter flipped, and came to rest upside down. McManus survived, and his landing immediately taught the other pilots something important. The surface might look firm from above, but conventional landing gear could punch straight through it. So the remaining fighter pilots changed their plan. They would land with the wheels up. One of those pilots was Harry Smith. He was just 23 years old. Before attempting his own landing, Smith circled McManus's overturned fighter. He wanted to know whether his friend was alive. Then he saw movement. McManus was climbing out. He had survived. Only then did Smith prepare his own aircraft. He shut down the engines, feathered the propellers, and brought the P-38 down onto its belly. One aircraft followed another, fighters, bombers, until 8 American warplanes lay scattered across the Greenland ice. And then came the remarkable part. All 25 men were alive. Not one had been killed, and despite 8 emergency landings, there were no serious injuries. The aircraft had failed to reach Europe, but their crews had survived. The men were alive, but they were stranded on the Greenland ice sheet. Around them stretched an enormous white wilderness. No roads, no towns, no easy route back to civilization. Even in July, conditions could be bitterly cold. The 2 B-17 bombers became shelters, giving the men somewhere to escape the wind, rest, and wait. Then, on the 3rd day, supplies appeared from the air. Someone knew exactly where they were. Rescue was coming. That didn't make the conditions comfortable, but it changed everything. They were no longer simply hoping to be found. They knew help was on the way. 9 days after the forced landings, a rescue party finally reached them by dog sled. The crews still had to travel across the ice before they could be evacuated, but the greatest uncertainty was over. They were leaving Greenland, and as they walked away, some of the pilots looked back. 8 almost new American warplanes remained behind, machines they had expected to take into war. Now they were being abandoned in the Arctic. The men had survived Greenland. The aircraft would have to take their chances. The war continued, the crews moved on, and the aircraft remained. Then the snow began to fall, winter after winter, year after year. Snow accumulated above the aircraft, compressing the layers beneath it. Snow became dense fern, fern became ice, and gradually the Lost Squadron disappeared. Decades passed. Then 2 men became fascinated by the idea of going back, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor. Their early expectations were optimistic. They imagined the aircraft might not be very deep. Maybe a tail would still be visible above the snow. They could locate one, dig around it, clear the aircraft, perhaps even get a P-38 running, and fly it home. Then they reached Greenland. There were no tails, no wings, no aircraft, nothing. The Lost Squadron had disappeared completely, and almost everything they had assumed was wrong. What began as an adventure became an obsession. They returned again and again. Searchers used magnetometers, radar, and increasingly sophisticated ground-penetrating equipment. Expedition followed expedition, and still nothing. Until eventually, something came back from beneath the ice. Radar suggested that something large lay below. But after years of searching, a signal on a screen was no longer enough. They wanted proof. A probe was driven down through the ice, then hauled back toward the surface. Attached to it were fragments, aircraft tubing, metal, painted aluminium. The Lost Squadron was still there. Of the 6 fighters, one appeared particularly promising. Harry Smith's P-38, the same aircraft he had belly landed in 1942. Photographs suggested it had survived the landing relatively well, and one small decision Smith had made before touching down now mattered. He had feathered his propellers. That decision prevented the blades from chopping into the ice, keeping them and the engines completely intact. A decision made by a 23-year-old pilot would influence what happened to his aircraft half a century later. And there was another small detail. When Smith climbed out of the P-38 in 1942, he left the canopy keys behind. The others reportedly found that amusing. After all, who was ever going to need them again? The aircraft was being abandoned in Greenland. But 50 years later, someone came back for it. By 1992, the team finally knew where Harry Smith's aircraft was. But knowing where it was only the beginning. Between them and the P-38 was ice, and an extraordinary amount of it. The fighter wasn't 10 feet down, or 50, or 100. It was approximately 268 feet beneath the surface, roughly the height of a 25-story building. There was no practical way to excavate a conventional hole that deep through a Greenland ice sheet. So the team developed another solution. It became known as the Super Gopher. The machine used heated water to melt its way downward, foot after foot. A narrow shaft descended deep into the ice. Eventually, the recovery workers themselves had to follow it. Hundreds of feet down, inside a tunnel only a few feet across. As they descended, the circle of daylight above gradually grew smaller, until almost everything around them was blue ice. And at the bottom was a World War II fighter. But Greenland had left its mark. The enormous pressure had distorted and damaged almost every part. There would be no simple moment where a crane lifted a complete aeroplane from the glacier. If the P-38 was going to reach the surface, it would have to come out, piece by piece. Then, on the 1st of August 1992, the major center section, or the big piece, finally emerged. Harry Smith's P-38 finally saw daylight once again. And there to witness part of the recovery was Brad McManus, the same man whose overturned fighter Smith had circled all those years earlier. Recovery was only the beginning. The P-38 was transported to Kentucky, where another enormous undertaking began: restoration. At first, the project was expected to take around 18 months. Instead, it took almost 10 years. Then, on the 26th of October 2002, the engines started. And 60 years after Harry Smith had put her down on the Greenland ice, she flew again. A World War II fighter, abandoned before reaching the war and buried beneath hundreds of feet of ice, had returned to the sky. In July 1942, 8 American warplanes landed on Greenland. 25 men were aboard them. They all survived, but the aircraft were left behind. For 50 years, Greenland hid them. One eventually returned, and against remarkable odds, it flew again. But beneath the ice of Greenland, the rest of the Lost Squadron remains, still buried, still moving slowly with the ice sheet. The men survived Greenland for 9 days. Glacier Girl survived it for 50 years. But even now, the ice of Greenland still hasn't given everything back.